Hi everyone, I'm Jack the Rambling Raconteur, and I hope that you're doing well. Now that it is April, National Poetry Month here in the US, and also spring, I thought it'd be fun to do a discussion of the Georgics by Virgil. It's a key work from Virgil, but it's not a well-known work. It's certainly not a widely read work in the 21st century. It's not as widely read as his epic, the Aeneid, or even his earlier pastoral poems, the Eclogues or the Bucolics. In fact, in the Portable Roman Reader, originally published by Viking Portable Library and later Penguin Classics, there's not a single line of the Georgics that was translated. So it's not a widely read work. And I think part of that is because it can be a very difficult poem to classify. There's a basic interpretation that it is a poetic almanac. There's another interpretation that perhaps it is a celebration of the farmer, of the yeoman farmer, the type of citizen who works hard and cultivated the Roman Republic and has a relationship with the land. And there are lines to suggest both of those interpretations. There are also a couple of hints about the influence of Lucretius and Epicurus on the young and much more mature Virgil. But as always, there's the evasive Virgil, the Virgil who's interested in a lot more than whatever that surface level interpretation is. And that's who I'll be excited to get to. But I do want to share just a couple of hints about those other surface interpretations. So it is 100% a poetic almanac. There's 4 books. There's one on bees. That's the 4th book. There's a book that deals with husbandry. How do you be a good shepherd? How do you raise the right types of horses and bulls? There's a book on agriculture, different types of farming, being able to dig into soil. And he goes into details. One idea that I thought was really interesting was you can tell the type of wine that will be produced by a vineyard in a certain soil if you take the soil and put it in a basket and then fill it with water and let the water drain through that soil. And if you taste the water and it has this really sour taste, then that will tell you that's going to be sour wine. So there are all these little interesting bits. There's one around how do you use the stars and to determine the seasons and make predictions based on that. That's happening across the Georgics. Not too many people quote any of those lines, though. But that is happening. There is also 100% some lines that celebrate the farmer, the yeoman farmer from Book 2. How lucky if they know their happiness are farmers, more than lucky, they for whom far from the clash of arms, the earth herself, most fair in dealing, freely lavishes an easy livelihood. It's interesting to note, if the earth is fair in dealing, what is it that's not fair in dealing? There's a hint about an evasion from Virgil. What if no palace with arrogant portal out of every cranny belches a mighty tide of morning callers, and no one gapes at doors inlaid so proudly with varied tortoiseshell, cloth tricked with gold and rare Corinthian bronzes? What if wool is white, not tainted with Assyrian poison, and honest olive oil not spoilt with cassia? Yet peace they have, and a life of innocence rich in variety. They have for leisure their ample acres, caverns, living lakes, cool tempes. What a wonderful life. He goes on at the end of this long passage. The farmer cleaves the earth with his curved plow. This is his year-long work, and thus he sustains his homeland. Thus his little grandchildren, his herds and trusty bullocks. Never a pause! The seasons teem with fruit, the young flocks of sheaves of Ceres corn. They load the furrows and burst the barns with produce. Then comes winter. Normally, like winter might be cold and vicious. No, in winter, the olive press is busy. So Virgil is surely celebrating the farmer. He's doing that. And it's part of that tradition of sort of the myth of the yeoman farmers here in the US, in Canada, in the UK, other European nations, the idea that the farmer and his family who provide for themselves, they're not relying on anybody else. They provide for themselves. They have this relationship with the land. They care for the land cares for them. They have this control over their lives. And it has always been a myth. And the evasions Virgil is making in just those passages that celebrate the farmer are fascinating to me, because Virgil knows that type of farmer basically doesn't exist anymore in his early Roman Empire that he's residing in. That type of yeoman farmer that his father was, that he to a certain extent was one of the last of, it has been replaced by these enormous landowners. All of those people, as he had already identified in his earlier work, the Eclogues, many of them lost their land in the various civil wars. And so he had seen a society where within just a few generations, the yeoman farmers of northern Italy, of the Roman Republic of Cisalpine Gaul, were given citizenship within the Roman Republic. His father, I believe it happened to his father, or if it happened with Virgil, it was at a very young age. So he experienced that, but then he experienced the loss of those farms. He saw his father's neighbors evicted for their land to be given to various people who had supported the winning side in one of the numerous civil wars of those final years of the Roman Republic and early Roman Empire. So when he's talking about this is a person who doesn't really exist anymore. He doesn't mention slavery at all. And he knows that many of those farms have been combined by large landholders to be worked by slaves. And while that slavery was different from the slavery that, existed here in the U.S., it was very comparable, at least, to the economic slavery that existed in many of the European nations across the Middle Ages. And so that myth of the yeoman farmer, he's exploding that with his evasions thousands of years earlier. But Virgil's far more interested in something else than pretending to celebrate a person who doesn't exist in his society. As with the Bucolics, as with the Aeneid and the numerous evasions there, he's really looking at the society he lives in and identifying that it is not a great place, that it's not a wonderful place. He had some jokes there about, poisoning wool or tainting olive oil or getting all of this annoying neighbors knocking on your doors in the city. But it's interesting to note that Virgil's looking at a very different world. It's a world that, as he notes, does not seem, he mentioned that line about the earth freely giving, lavishly giving. But he also notes earlier in book 1, I have seen selected seeds with care, long tested, yet degenerate, unless man's effort picked the largest year by year. So it is, for everything by nature's law tends to the worst, slips ever backward. As with a man who scarce propels his boat against the stream, if once his arms relax, the current sweeps it headlong down the rapids. And there's this Lucretian ideal, the idea of the swerve, this idea that things are not necessarily just going to get better and better, that the only way to resist, to exist by resistance, is to continually put effort in. And while he's exploring that within this idea of farming, that you have to work every day and every season, there's some activity to be involved in. There's no time off. There's no vacation. He's also drawing that parallel to the society he exists in. How is it, how has the Roman Republic and this nascent empire degenerated? Whose effort is picking it up year by year? And from there, we begin to see that Virgil is willing to use some dynamite metaphors to examine the society he lives in. He notes, who dares call sun a liar? He it is who often warns of dark revolts afoot, conspiracy and cancerous growth of war. He too, when Caesar fell, showed pity for Rome, hiding his radiant head in lurid gloom, that a guilty age feared everlasting night. And he goes on to describe the horrors of civil war. A mighty voice and phantoms ghastly pale were seen at nightfall. Cattle, dare I tell it, spoke. Rivers ceased to flow and the earth gaped. In temples, ivories wept and the bronzes sweated. Ariadnes, the king of rivers, burst his banks in violent spate and washed away whole forests over all the countryside on cattle with their stalls. At the same time, sinister filaments constantly were found, marring the entrails' omens. Constantly springs ran with blood, and through the hours of darkness, high cities echoed with the howl of wolves. Never did lightnings flash more frequently from a clear sky. Never so often blazed dire comets. And he makes a clear link to Philippi, a battle between the assassins of Caesar and the forces of Antony and Octavian. And then he notes, surely a time will come in those regions. The farmer heaving the soil with his curved plow will come on spears all eaten up with rust, or strike with his heavy hoe on hollow helmets, and gape at the huge bones in the upturned graves. This is not a celebration of farming. This is a book that is willing to stare his society squarely in the eye and identify that it is not a society built on merit. It is not a place that is kind. It is a place that it has removed most of the farmers. He notes later on the aftermath of a plague. The wolf at night scours for no place of ambush. Around the fold nor prowls about the flocks. A sharper pang has tamed him. Timid does and stags, once shy, now stray among the hounds and wander round the buildings. Now the tide strands on the edge of the shore like shipwrecked corpses, the brood of the boundless sea and every species of swimming creatures. Seals in panic flight take to the rivers. Vainly the viper seeks security in the windings of her lair. She, with the startled water snake, whose scales bristle with terror, dies. The very birds find in the air no favor. Even they plunge headlong, leaving life beneath the clouds. Changes of pasture now give no relief. He had earlier noted this idea of crop rotation, an idea that was not seriously implemented for well over 1,000 years. That crop rotation would be a great idea, and that sense of cycles, that sense of degeneration and a way to interrupt degeneration. Here he's noting that even in this plague, that doesn't exist. Right, here we go. And now the fury dealt out death in droves, and even in the very stalls piled up the foully rotting carcasses until men learned to bury them in pits, since hides were no more use, and nobody could cleanse the flesh with water or reclaim it with fire. They could not even shear the fleeces. So eaten up were these with sores and filth, nor touched the rotting web. If any tried to don the loathsome clothing, feverish blisters and filthy sweat ran down his stinking limbs. He had not long to wait. The accursed fire would soon be preying on his infected body. And that calls to mind the reference to the fate of Hercules and the way he met his untimely end. So with all of that going on, and with Virgil describing the plagues that exist in society, the damage that civil war has wrought on his neighbors, on his family, on his lands, and he has, again, filled it. He's interspersed these as these almost like apocalyptic climaxes to the various books. He notes, who would he like to be? And he says, for my own part, that my chiefest prayer would be, may the sweet muses, whose acolyte I am, smitten with boundless love, accept my service. Teach me to know the paths of the stars in heaven, the eclipses of the sun and the moon's travails, the cause of earthquakes, what it is that forces the deep seas to swell and burst their barriers, and then sink back again, why winter suns hasten so fast to plunge themselves in the ocean, or what it is that slows the lingering nights. But if some chill in the blood about the heart bars me from mastering these sides of nature, then will I pray that I may find fulfillment in the country and the streams that water valleys, love rivers and woods unglamorous. So if I can't harness this knowledge that he's kind of been pointing out in a society that's consumed by civil war, where, a man who scarce propels his boat against the stream, if once his arms relax, the current sweeps it headlong down the rapids. In a society where that knowledge may not work, could I just be out of it? Could I go somewhere else? And he had identified a different place in the Eclogues. He identified this mythical Arcadia or Arcady, where it was this, bucolic paradise of the imagination that he would like to go to. Blessed is he whose mind had power to probe the causes of things and trample underfoot all terrors and inexorable fate and the clamor of devouring Acheron. But happy too is he who knows the gods of the countryside, knows Pan and old Sylvanus and the sister nymphs. Neither the people's gift, the fasces, nor the purple robes of kings, nor treacherous feuds of brother against brother disturb him. And so perhaps there we have a reason to read the Georgics. It's a poem that, confronts the war. It confronts the horrors of human against human. It looks at the reality of, the toil in nature, how hard it can be, and yet notes that even a period of drought or a period where there's a pestilence can at times seem to be more fair than the trials of civil war, and that that the companionship, the peace within nature is what he is seeking. It's interesting that he never really mentions that he wants to see a lot of other people there with him, which I think is a very sad place for Virgil, but also perhaps is in line with who he was as a human being, as an individual, was that he didn't necessarily feel a need for companionship there in his Arcadia. So it's an interesting work, and one that I certainly will return to. I had mentioned, of course, the Eclogues. These are fantastic poems as well. These are much more widely read. There's a great deal of symbolism in these, and I did a video on these last April, so I'll link that in the description box. When I think of nature, I of course think of the nonfiction nature writers like E.O. Wilson, writers like Loren Eiseley, writers who really wanted to get into appreciating nature, and not just from this level of human arrogance. Certainly Henry David Thoreau comes to mind, and particularly the idea of Thoreau sort of on his own in nature. I had mentioned, of course, the influence of Lucretius, the nature of things, and also Epicurus. It's fascinating to me that the Georgics was Michael de Montaigne's favorite poem. And it's not a poetic almanac. It can't, Montaigne would never have noted a poetic almanac as his favorite poem. He was always concerned in the human condition and in human knowledge and in the mind and the spirit. In the same way, this work from Virgil reminds me of the concern Socrates and certainly Plato had for humans. And how do we develop? How do we become the best versions of ourselves? I've mentioned, of course, the Aeneid. This is the next work from Virgil I'll be reading probably next year, maybe later this year. The fantastic Virgil in English edition. If you ever find this, I would highly recommend it. It has multiple translations of the key sort of passages from Virgil, and allows people to see different translations from across centuries of a solid like 400 years of translations of Virgil. I was reading the various versions of the Georgics, the influence on James Thomson with his The Seasons and such. And certainly Poets on a Landscape from Gilbert Hyatt is a wonderful reference work for Roman poetry. And then finally, once I reread the Aeneid, I'm planning to read The Death of Virgil by Herman Broch, a modernist work that examines Virgil. So I certainly look forward to these. But this was the Georgics, and let me know. Let me know if you have a preferred translation of the Aeneid as well. I'm going to plan to read the Stanley Lombardo version next, but I hope everybody's doing well. Thank you.